Hey, what's up? It's Sifu Kuttel, and in this video, we're going to be doing some snake-style Kung Fu, and we're going to be working on fluency of technique. Now, what I mean by fluency of technique is very similar to how you would think of fluency in language. When you're learning a language, you first learn the alphabet, then you learn how to make words, and then you make phrases, and then you can speak and convey your ideas and really articulate in different ways. And being able to be flexible in how you speak and being able to elaborate in how you speak, these are all things that are very more into the fluent level of speaking. Now, when it comes to our snake-style Kung Fu and techniques, we need to be able to bridge what we've already established in our stance work, in our basic technique work, and then also just looking at simple step techniques like my opponent throws a punch, I block, I neutralize, and then I counterattack. And then also just forms training, and then taking that step to the more freestyle element that we find in sparring. Now, developing that fluency, this is just a very, very small piece of the puzzle. This is just a little bit of an exercise. It's a drill. It's not going to be the answer to everything, but this will help add depth to your training, because after you work with this fluency training, it's important to go back and do your basic drilling, go over your basic techniques, your conditioning, and going over your forms training, because things that you learn in fluency training can actually open up to new understandings within those, in your forms and in your drills, which can again come back and benefit your fluency training and benefit your actual martial technique when you use it in more of a sparring type context. Okay, so with that said, it's to really totally simplify it, we're looking at this as almost doing like shadow boxing with a very specific rule set or some restrictions and limitations. But I do want to kind of build it up level by level, and once you can see how this is done, you can increase the levels and make it work more and more for you in more of an advanced context. But let's get started, and I'll show you how we can build from the very basic level of fluency training. The first method of our fluency training is going to come down to a very, very simple approach. We're going to do a block and a strike, and we are going to make sure that within this, we have the limitations of using only one hand for blocking, so my left hand is going to be doing the block, and my right hand is going to be doing the strike, and it's going to be the same block and same strike each time. So the variation that we're looking for here is the stances. And we're going to do this a very traditional way. So you really want to establish your traditional Kung Fu stances, your cat stance, your horse stance, your bow stance, your twist stance, your kneeling stance. All of these stances, you want to really make sure that you pause and sink into that stance, get good weight distribution and good hip position for your strike. Now, one of the things you should be looking for at this level is not only being able to just successfully get to a stance, do your techniques, your block, and then move to your next stance and strike, but also you should be looking towards hip position. When we're doing any kind of martial arts training and striking, our hips are what are going to be able to really drive in the strike, give us more rotational power for our torso, which will extend through the strike itself, giving us more reach and more power. So pay attention to your hip positions as we do this. Now again, I want to establish the ground rules here. I really want to pay attention to my traditional stances, and I want to make sure that only my left hand is doing the blocking technique, which is going to be Kyu, and I'm going to fire my snake strike to the throat with the Jinji. And from there, it's now just playing from stance to stance, angle to angle, and then pausing and making sure I'm in a good stance. So we can start in a cat stance, blocking and pressing down, and then a horse stance and poke to the eyes. I could do the same thing, block, and then into a bow stance. I can do the same thing and into a kneeling stance. Or I can come across into a more oblique stance or horizontal stance. And then I can move forward with the cat stance, drop it back and go low. I can go forward, forward. I can step back and then forward, or twist on the spot and then move back. But always, I'm going to make sure that I do a good stance, as well as one hand in particular is blocking while the other one is striking. Do this until it feels more fluid. You don't want to have to be in a position where you're thinking about what stance to do next. Really, anything counts. So even if it seems a bit strange to step back or to shift forward, try it. This is where you learn about the technique. Our second phase in fluency training is going to be less of a focus on specific stance and more of a focus on mobility. So rather than thinking of hitting a horse stance, cat stance, bow stance, kneeling stance, any of these kinds of traditional stances and pausing in them, now I want you to focus on staying mobile. We're moving forward, we're moving backward, and we're moving laterally. Don't worry so much about like head motion. We're not in that phase yet. But for now, I want you to just still focus on that footwork. You're going to be moving in, blocking and attacking. Change your stance so you have your other lead foot forward, and you're going to be having a little bit more mobility here, a little bit more freedom to move. Now, before we add the snake hands, let's do a quick review of our mobility footwork when it comes to advancing, retreating, and moving laterally. A good rule of thumb is step first with the foot in that direction. Now, what I mean by this is if we're in our stance and I want to move forward, I step forward with my front foot first. If I want to move back, I use my back foot first. When it comes to moving laterally, this is where you don't want to think of front foot, back foot. You want to actually think of left and right. So if I want to step to my left foot moves first, my right foot follows. If I want to step to the right, my right foot steps first and my left foot follows, okay? Now, when it comes to the hand techniques, I want it to be nice and fluid. So don't worry about power here. Just make sure that you have decent accuracy, that your hand is at least at the correct level for striking, okay? Now, for most of these, it is going to be one technique, almost like this combination, 1-1 or 1-2 per step. So if I advance forward, I step in, 1-2, step in, 1-2, stepping back, 1-2, stepping back, 1-2. However, you can also step back, block, and then step forward. You can step forward and then shift back. You have some opportunity here to shift and even step between the two, but I like to keep these ones combined, keep it simple as just advancing forward, getting used to that, moving back and retreating, getting used to that. And then also moving laterally, you'll find that if the hand on that side moves first, it's a lot easier. So my left hand and my left leg are going to coordinate really well. It'll feel a little awkward at first, stepping out to the right and using that left hand, but you really should just get comfortable with that and just get comfortable with moving and doing that footwork. Now, of course, here is also where you can use turning. You can do your quarter turns. We can follow up. And then, of course, too, from here, you can always take an opportunity to go to one of the more traditional stances if you want, like going into a cat stance or using this to step into a low kneeling stance, or like I did with the lateral horizontal bow stance. Our third phase in fluency training is now going to lessen the restrictions on the hands. So I want you to continue with that mobility for your footwork, forward, backward, moving laterally, but now I want you to alternate. So we're still going to stay under a single block, a single strike, and then the same style of block and same style of strike. But now I want you to switch hands. So whatever hand is blocking is going to be striking next. And you'll see after you strike, that same hand is going to have to set up for the blocking technique. But now you're less restricted by having to only do a single side, but now you're trying to alternate and move from one hand to the next. And then as you get into this, you can also kind of move into same hand block and then attack as well. Now, the first thing I would suggest at this phase is to get used to that hand circling, striking, and then that same hand circling again, striking, circling, striking, circling, striking. Just get comfortable with this first before adding the footwork into it. But then once you're there, it's quite natural. So we're going to be using our mobility footwork, circling, striking, circling, striking, circling, striking, circling, striking. Just getting comfortable with moving in these directions. Now you'll find that one hand is going to start being it'll be blocking, and then you'll be striking with that one hand in the front, but you'll never have a chance for it to be behind, so simply change sides. So now that has the opportunity to be the front hand or the back hand. And you have an opportunity here. You can take the time to work in more of the traditional stances. If you're moving back, you can shift back into a cat stance. You can also do some of these horizontal stances. And then of course, as we're stepping out to the side, we have that opportunity to move this way. We can go back and forth, and you have a chance to alternate from the hands. You really want to get comfortable with this before you add power. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about being super fast. You just want to think of keeping things moving continuously. Really develop that fluency in just continuous movement. Now at this point, I am going to conclude the video. You pretty much have a basic idea of how we can work from phase to phase to phase and then integrate more freestyle elements to the point where you actually just begin shadowboxing with snake style. I don't think that you should ever see this as you graduate away from that first phase or that second phase, but rather I think it's a great way to implement new techniques and become more familiar with them and more fluent with them as you develop and integrate them into your just regular shadow boxing. So what I would suggest from this point moving into the next phase is to add a little bit either before or after your prescribed technique. So maybe you do 2 blocks before that strike, or maybe you do just that single block and then you follow up with 3 techniques, whether it be the same thing, hopscotch, snakes, or from here you have 1, 2, 3, and then you can move into another technique from there. But keeping those little bits of restrictions helps you get comfortable with stepping forward into it, stepping back into it, moving laterally, turning around and using this technique. And when you understand your angles, when you understand your footwork, when you understand your hand techniques with this, it becomes much, much more easy to employ in a shadow boxing context or an actual freestyle or sparring context. I hope you enjoy this training. This is something that you can take and apply it to any type of training. This is not limited to snake, but I did think that this is a great way to understand that fluency because we really want to see that for snake style. All right, hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next.